Alright guys, this is chapter 21 on water pollution. So the notes I'm kind of going to go over. It may take one video, it may take two. I'm going to try to run through it pretty quick so you'll have an idea of what you need to know for this unit. So you do need to understand how important nature is at purifying sewage. You need to make sure you're looking at a case study for artificial wetlands and how plants, and not only plants but also other organisms such as fish and oysters, can serve as ecological wastewater treatment facilities where they end up purifying water as they're eating and ending up using them as waste products and decomposing and just breaking everything down. So it's kind of like a living machine. As far as water pollution, we still need to come back to the two topics called point source and non-point source. I'm not going to go over those. You can read those yourself on the PowerPoint. Let me know if you have any questions on them. A couple other diseases that you do need to be aware of is you can actually, from water pollution, cross-contaminate things such as bacteria and viruses. Things like parasites can actually be in the water, and then if you come into contact with these things through like fecal contamination or undercooked food, or if you're cooking with water that has a parasite in it, you can be affected if you are in that area. So if you're traveling outside of the country, you need to be aware of the possible water contamination. You do need to know fecal coliform. This is a petri dish that has a type of agar in it that is selective for bacteria that could potentially pose disease issues or can potentially cause disease. We would check for this in water sources. So you take a sample of water from like Lake Lanier or a stream, put it on the petri dish, let it incubate, and see if it actually grows any of the bacteria that we're looking for, so specific types. Right, and then dissolved oxygen. We've already kind of talked about dissolved oxygen. Really, really important to understand water quality and dissolved oxygen go hand in hand. So the more dissolved oxygen you have, the better quality of water you are going to see. You're going to see more organisms. You're going to see them thriving. You're not going to see a ton of plant nutrients. And basically fish species can survive at right around like 4 parts per million. That's the ppm. Anything lower than that, you're going to start seeing them die off. And that means that we're having like heavy pollution in the area. We're going to get to this when we show you the picture or the diagram about biological oxygen and dissolved oxygen that go together, called the oxygen sag curve, which is next. So let me go ahead and go to the picture. That makes a lot more sense here. So what you're going to end up seeing is dissolved oxygen is very high, so we have a lot of oxygen available for the organisms that are in the water, and then your biological oxygen demand is very low. So you want to think about this in terms of economics, so supply and demand. So supply is high, demand is low. Well, if we end up having any type of pollution, waste that gets put into the water source here, then what's going to start happening is the bacteria or decomposers are going to see that they have a job. So they're going to end up increasing, and those decomposers and bacteria end up using the same oxygen that the fish are using. So then there's going to be a competition between the amount of oxygen that's there. So you're going to end up seeing the oxygen is going to take a dive, and the demand for oxygen is going to increase, because you've got not only your typical organisms, but then you've got your decomposers. So this is where it's going to start changing. As you continue with downstream with this pollution, and as the decomposers are breaking it down, you're going to end up in the septic zone where very little life is going to be found. You're going to have still that whole oxygen, the dissolved oxygen has dropped. This is that oxygen sag curve that we're talking about. So it takes a little bit of time for them to kind of change places again, as far as the dissolved oxygen and the BOD to come back up and change places and begin to finally have a normal, healthy stream again. But I also noticed that is if the pollution is only put out in one area. If you have more pollution put out in multiple areas down a stream or a river, this process is going to continue to decay and end up causing problems. So you're looking at oxygen demanding waste, so those bacteria and decomposers, which also can produce heat and change the water temperature, which will also affect the type of fish or organisms that are going to be able to survive in that stream. Alright, freshwater systems, we've kind of talked about enough of freshwater. Your biggest things are going to be industrial waste and sewage. Remember, we did talk about thermal pollution from nuclear power plants. Many times when we're looking at dilution of pollutants, we're not going to see that in lakes or in streams because there's not enough volume of water. If we're looking at it versus an ocean, if we are putting waste into the ocean due to the amount of water in the ocean currents, it tends to dilute or remove most of those pollutants very, very quickly, as opposed to them in a lake or a river settling to the bottom or kind of being more stagnant over time, which can become a huge problem as far as groundwater contamination. Alright, two types of eutrophication. You have eutrophication, which is normal. It is a natural process where you will have dead plants that run off, get into the water supply, and then they end up causing plant nutrients to be in water, so like in Lake Lanier. Not a bad thing. If we have cultural eutrophication, this is caused by human activities. So it's not just the natural process of plant nutrients running off from the surface of the land into the water, but this is our human activities, such as using fertilizer to increase plant growth, ends up running off into the water. Like, let's say you put fertilizer on your crops, it rains, it rushes most of that off into the water supply. You become having, or you have high levels of nitrate and phosphate containing material or runoff, and then that's going to allow algae to start to grow and grow and grow and grow. And there are some problems that we're going to talk about with that as well. Alright, so this is a really good picture to kind of look at everything to see that you have pesticides. All this stuff does not contain or happen in the same area this close together, but just so you know how groundwater can become contaminated. So from pesticide or fertilizer use, from mining, from polluted rainfall that may fall, like acid rainfall, if we're using any type of injection wells for hazardous material, if we're having a landfill, if we're having gasoline stations, and what if the tank that holds the gasoline underneath the ground leaks into the groundwater supply, people's homes that have septic tanks or wastewater treatment plants. So there's all kinds of different possibilities of how contamination of groundwater can happen. So there's actually 3 different types of waste that we want to talk about. So we want to talk about whether or not a waste is degradable. So non-degradable waste is going to be something that's very toxic. It doesn't come out of the system. You can't get rid of it. It just sort of sits there. Lead is one, R6 another, fluoride, some of your heavy, they're sometimes called toxic heavy metals. Other ones are going to be slowly degradable waste. So ones that will sit there for a long period of time, such as decades, but they aren't necessarily permanently there. It just takes much longer for them to go away. You also have what's called biodegradable waste. Bio meaning that it was once living. So this is going to be your idea of things that used to be maybe a tree or a plant. So cotton material, paper products, cardboard, things like that are going to be biodegradable. So as soon as water touches it, it starts to break down and mold or decay over time. Alright, groundwater pollution, you have prevention and cleanup. You need to know 3 for each side. So a lot of your prevention is obviously not putting in hazardous material, making sure we find substitutes, trying to keep chemicals out of the environment. Cleanup efforts are going to be how we can clean up, use microorganisms to clean up, how we can use nanoparticles or some other kind of technology to end up removing the chemical. Alright, as far as ocean pollution, oceans are typically not overloaded. They do a really good job of moving pollution around. It's a really, really vast open space. The ocean currents help move it. Just the sheer volume of water help to break down large quantities of pollutants. The bad thing is that most of the pollution gets into the ocean from land, especially oil and trash goes from the land into the water. Okay, so your coastal areas have a much more serious problem with pollution than out in the open ocean, just because that's where people live, that's where people vacation, people want to be on the beach. Okay, most of the world's population is going to live near the coast. And here are a couple ideas or examples. We're going to talk about an oxygen depleted zone later in class, so we'll mention that a little bit later. But all of this stuff, as far as these industries and what's happening on the land, eventually makes it into the water. right? Harmful algal blooms, which we're also going to talk about this. But basically all that fertilizer runoff and sewage runoff is going to allow so many nutrients to become high levels in the water supply, whether it's freshwater or ocean water, and those are going to allow algae to end up blooming, and then the algae can have a negative effect on the organisms and the dissolved oxygen that's within the water. This is the case study that we're actually going to look at a little bit more in depth later, so I'm going to skip that for now. The Chesapeake Bay, I will tell you right now for the test, you have to know this. Chesapeake Bay, they had an issue with the oysters. They also had runoff from other states that were coming into Chesapeake Bay. And Chesapeake Bay is right here. They were contaminating that location. They had to put in some strategies. You need to look this up in your textbook, and you have to know some of the strategies that they use. That will be questions on the test. Already talked about most of this as far as the majority of the pollution from the ocean actually comes from land. Very few times are we actually seeing in history where we're having major oil spills from mining or getting oil from underneath the crust in the ocean. Particularly the oil is actually coming from detrimental activities that we're doing on land. Alright, coastal water pollution, you can kind of read these solutions yourself as far as prevention and cleanup. Let me know if you have questions about these. They're fairly simple once we kind of get into looking at it, such as recycling oil, making sure we regulate coastal development. Improvement is going to be obviously cleaning up oil spills. We want to make sure we're not doing the cleanup side, we need to be doing the prevention. So we're going to have to look at a solution of trying to reduce the amount of pollution that's actually making it to our waterways, whether it's to the ocean or to freshwater. We've got to stop runoff, because that's the major thing of how any of these chemicals or pollutants are making it from land into the water source, is simply with runoff. Definitely know your Clean Water Act, and you need to know your Safe Drinking Water Act. So the legislation is starting to pick up a little bit where you're having to know certain laws, and you're going to need to know what they mean. Discharge trading policy is basically, if I have a certain amount of pollution I can release, you have a certain amount of pollution you can release, my company does less than your company, you can set up like a barter system to where you pay me for my extra credits that are left over, so you can end up polluting more. So it's a loophole in the system. Alright, septic tank, I'm actually going to talk about this myself, but you need to read up on it. We should have had enough webquests so you kind of get how they're actually laid out and how they're set up. Primary and secondary sewage, same thing, we've already kind of gone over this stuff. So you should be good. Let me know if you have questions. Right, some stuff that we do need to worry about is groundwater contamination with exposure, dust particles, a lot of times with landfills and stuff, or with using sludge from wastewater treatment facilities. There may be odor. We want to make sure that there's not going to be hazardous material or disease agents or things that can potentially cause disease that are going to come into contact with livestock or humans or into a water supply. Right, and this one is talking about your natural and artificial wetlands as a sewage treatment. So you are definitely going to need to know, like here's an example, you don't have to know this exact one, but you need to have the basic idea of how wetlands could possibly be used as far as their natural ecological role to treat sewage as an alternative source. So that's one of those innovative things that I really wanted you to be able to put into your wastewater treatment project. Here's the Safe Drinking Water Act, talking about, maximum containment levels. So all drinking water, whether, it's tap water or bottled water, still has to meet all of these federal regulations as well as state regulations. And then some solutions for water pollution. All of them are pretty simple, just kind of very general, stopping the non-point source runoff, making sure we recycle, trying to reduce as much degradation as possible. And that is about it for the water pollution. I'll cover a couple things that I mentioned later for septic tanks and the oxygen depleted zones in the Gulf of Mexico later. Before the test, but later. Let me know if you have questions. Thanks.